board tonight. And I will be sending out the link as well. So if you do want to share it with someone who missed tonight.
Wonderful. That's great because I think being able to, sometimes you never know when the doorbell's going to ring or the phone is going to ring and you have to leave off and you can pick up again later in the recording. Well, so Nicole and I were just talking beforehand about, my interest in Allan Freelon, and this is a project that has had an exhibition at the Brandywine already, but just a small exhibition only of prints and the things that we have in our collection. I really think that with new research that's emerging, new evidence, documents, and history that's emerging, that the Freelon family of artists is really interesting for future research, future work, a future exhibition catalog. At the Brandywine Museum of Art, you probably know we have a big focus on the Wyeth family of artists, and it's a unique perspective to be within a family of other artists and creative people. So I think I really like the idea of seeing how other families of artists have worked throughout history as well. So I wanted, many of you probably didn't get to visit our exhibition when we had it at the beginning of 2024. So this is just a brief look inside our gallery. The exhibition was called Allan Freelon, Painter, Printmaker, Teacher, and it showed some of his work, but really I focus more, and you see lots of words on the wall, I focus more on his biography and trying to understand who he was, not just as an artist, but as a citizen of Philadelphia, because and that's where the service aspect came from. He served his community, he served his school district, he served his country, he served his students, and all sorts of community groups as well. So this was an interesting addition that I'm learning more about as I study his artwork as well. So a quick view around our gallery. There's in the corner, there is the painting that the Brandywine owns, and a little bit of background about Mr. Freelon in general. He was born in 1895 in South Philadelphia, or in Philadelphia. He attended South Philadelphia High School for boys, and then he went on to the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art, which then became Philadelphia Museum of Art and the University of the Arts. He was studying not just making art, but being an art teacher as well. His emphasis has been primarily on painting, but what I'm discovering is his interest in printmaking, and very new in my research since this exhibition, his work as a photographer as well. So these are all interesting factors that we'll weave together here tonight. Maybe just starting with a little bit of his service history before he accomplished himself as an artist. He, in 1918, was commissioned in the U.S. Army. And these are two photographs from his own personal papers of his service records, the 6th and 7th Battalion at Camp Dodge in November of 1918, and the Officer Training School at Camp Meade in 1918. So both were places where he served. Because he was studying a program to become a teacher, he was commissioned to do educational programs within the Army. So he served to train other officers. So the experience he had during the war, he was stateside the whole time, working in these locations, training other officers, but he had a very difficult experience during the war. The year 1918 was rough all around. Because there was an influenza outbreak that was just as deadly as the war, and he experienced that. By the end of his wartime, by the end of his service, he talked about what he learned there during his time away, and he said it was just modern scientific ways of murdering his fellow man. He was really deeply impacted by the events and the experiences of seeing soldiers being in the army, understanding what the war was about. This is another view, not from his personal papers, but Black soldiers at Fort Dodge. This is a postcard that is in a number of historical societies, also a place where Freelon would have been. And the year 1918 was also particularly bad at Fort Dodge. Because in addition to this influenza outbreak, they had 700 soldiers die while he was there of the flu, about 50 per day. And they literally ran out of room, time, and energy to bury the bodies. So many of the men are buried in unmarked graves. And even those that did not die from the flu, there was 10,000 soldiers who were sick and 2,000 with pneumonia. So it was a really terrible time for him to serve there. In addition, in July, there was an incident. This is, as you may have realized in reading the captions, an infantry where Black officers were being trained, and there was an incident with people in the town that led to 3 Black soldiers being accused and convicted of a crime that led to their hanging. And all the Black soldiers of the camp were made to come and witness the hanging. I know this is grim stuff, but it does affect Allan Freelon's work, his artwork later on, his opinions on some social issues. And so we will see this experience during the war in 1918 and witnessing a hanging come back in his work again. I realize I can't push that button with this up. There we go. 1918 was also a good year for Allan Freelon. He got married. He was on leave. He came home and he got married. So here's a page from his wedding album. He married Mary Julia Coyget, and these are, he was in his uniform for his wedding. So pages of he and his bride and flower girls, I guess you'd say, bridesmaids and wedding guests that were there. So it was a very fraught roller coaster year for him. In 1918, he was, this is Freelon in his uniform, I think during the same time he was home getting married. He was discharged in 1919 as a second lieutenant. And this is just, maybe the historian nerd in me that really was just amazed to find the documents that exist out there in the world that are connected to him. So his statement of service, his honorable discharge, that gives us even just a little bit more information, his physical exam, his physical condition, that he was honorably discharged. Though later on, the experience of the war did cause him to have what is described often as a nervous breakdown because of the stress over the events of the day. Oop, I went backwards. And just to add to that, later down the line, World War II, we have a photograph here from Freelon Records showing us Mr. Freelon there in the background with some of his students protesting World War II. And so that experience during the war never left him. And I think it's something he instilled in young people throughout Philadelphia, and Mr. Freelon is just sort of tucked underneath the sign that says, we don't want to be World War III veterans. So that just is an experience he had and then transferred to even young students to share his experiences with. And his granddaughter, Maya Freelon, is working on some artistic projects of her own that enlighten us more about Allan Freelon's service. Still in the background phases, not getting to a lot of art yet, but immediately after being discharged, he resumed his studies. He was at the University of Pennsylvania studying psychology. It was called the school was the Philadelphia School of Pedagogy at that point, but it has been subsumed into University of Pennsylvania. just going to run down the list of degrees because this man had a degree from every institution there was in the city of Philadelphia. He was, as you'll hear as we go along, almost immediately after graduating in 1919, he was hired by the Philadelphia school department. He was appointed then in 1921. He was appointed as an art teacher. But by 1921, he was already being promoted and appointed to be the assistant director of art education for the entire city of Philadelphia's school system. He was the first African American to be appointed to the school district administration, period. And then he kept that job for more than 40 years. So he was a steadfast proponent for the arts in Philadelphia. He continued to work doing his own artwork, as we'll see, but also always learning. So the fact that we have a picture of him in his cap and gown is appropriate. He went on to get the next degree was a Bachelor of Science from the Pennsylvania Museum School of Industrial Art in 1925, and that's not going to be the last degree he'll have. But getting into his art experiences, besides teaching, he was always looking for new art experiences. So he had gone to these more structured schools like University of Pennsylvania, eventually the Philadelphia Museum School, University of the Arts. But he also began studying privately, not through a school, with Hugh Henry Breckinridge. Now, Breckinridge was a very well-respected teacher at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He taught there for more than 40 years. He was a modernist. He was someone who would teach anything from Impressionism up through, early modernism, encouraging his students to freely explore color, not be tied to sort of the imitation of what you see with your eyes, but to be more expressive. So there's a great photograph on the left-hand side in 1927, and it's such an art classroom. The ladies are wearing smocks. There's sculptures in the background. I'm sure somebody somewhere has a paintbrush, a stool sitting there, and you see young Allan Freelon on the left-hand side. Over on the right-hand side, in his very stylish boater hat, in around 1930, he's in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Now, remember, he is maintaining an academic year schedule, so the summers are often free for him to pursue his own artwork. And Hugh Henry Breckinridge, with his schedule at the Pennsylvania Academy, had the same opportunity. So he began to go to Gloucester, Massachusetts in about 1920 to paint himself, but then people were following him. His students were following him, including Allan Freelon, who began going to Gloucester around 1927. So right around the same time we see him in the classroom over on the left-hand side. So Gloucester for him is not just more school, but an informal school and a totally different landscape to work in than Philadelphia has been providing for him. He joined the North Shore Art Association in Gloucester and the Gloucester Society of the Artists. He is studying there at a summer school that Breckinridge starts just for summer students. And he continues his own education. I'll digress a little bit here to say that, that education didn't end again when he was back in Philadelphia. During the school year, he is learning printmaking with Earl Horder at the Graphic Sketch Club in Philadelphia. And he started a literary magazine called Black Opals around the same time. He's a very busy guy. He was the art director, but it was primarily a literary magazine. He also, 1927 to 30, started taking classes at the Barnes Foundation. So he is just, craving more and more education of all sorts of ways. To round out his degrees in 1943, eventually he got a degree from Tyler, master's degree from Tyler in art education. And the title of his thesis was, "Can art appreciation and art history be taught successfully by one who does not practice creative art himself?" That was the question he wanted to answer. And the short answer in his thesis, if you read it, is no, you have to paint in order to teach painting. But it's really interesting to even understand that aspect. Oh, here is Breckenridge's class. You can see all the classmates, and it is very much summer school. There will be ladies who are able to paint, because some of these summer schools, like William Merritt Chase or Breckenridge offered, did not carry the same restrictions that other bigger institutions did about women enrolling in classes, about Black students enrolling in classes. And so it was an opportunity for people who were denied educational resources other ways to expand their own education. A little bit later on, he continues going to Gloucester every year. The school closes in, I think, 37 maybe. So about 10 years after Freelon begins going there, but even going through his own personal papers, I love this combination, because I've seen this painting on the right-hand side from around 1935 reproduced in some of the literature about Freelon. But when I went through his own photographs in his personal papers, I found a painting of him painting that painting. So it's just a little wonderful piece of documentary history showing that he was a plein air painter, someone who worked outside right in front of what he was painting, and immersing himself in the scenery, in the environment, getting the lighting directly from the sun. So plein air painting was something that, 20th century early 20th century artists were accepting more and more as, an alternative to going into a school and into a studio to be trained. Plus the fact that it took place in summers in great, beach communities and resort communities, didn't hurt people wanting to join up. Now, I'm talking a lot tonight about the new research, the things I'm learning, what's being discovered. And part of this is I've got a set of the photographs here that I've recently seen, photographs of Gloucester by Allan Freelon. So in the late 20s and 30s, he is very much an experimental photographer. His artistic practice isn't confined to painting and printmaking and drawing. He's taking up the camera as well. And this is all new. This is not discussed in any of the previous literature on Allan Freelon. And this is just a wonderful, opportunity, because the Freelon family has donated all of Mr. Freelon's personal materials, papers, slides, teaching lecture notes, photographs, everything, to the Archives of American Art, who is in the process of digitizing it and making it available for researchers. So I am like their number one thorn in their side, going, are you finished with any more yet? Do you have anything more for me to look at yet? Now, I want you to get a sense of, this is very much the kind of scenery you might take if you took a trip to Gloucester, Massachusetts. A lovely shot of, the local character, the sea, life in the fishing village. But when Freelon photographed it, it became subject matter for him to use later in other works of art. So these are etchings that he created probably back in Philadelphia after his time in the summer. So not only would he be sketching and painting, but taking photographs that he could return to Philadelphia with and continue working on art throughout the rest of the year. And I think it's sort of goes without saying that the compositions that he takes photographs of readily turn into the compositions that he makes prints of. And here's one that was particularly striking to me. I know the print Unloading Fish, it's in the Brandywine collection. And I just saw this photograph that he took in Gloucester, and it just reminded me, it just immersed me as a viewer into exactly what he must have been seeing and thinking about, and the source material and influence that his visits to Gloucester had on him later. Finally, paintings, Amanda. Finally, some paintings. This is a view of Gloucester. So most of the paintings that we are aware of that have come to light are these Gloucester scenes. It seems like he was quite prolific when he was spending time in the summer times in Gloucester. And this is a popular style in the American Impressionist mode that would have been really popular with patrons, whether they're patrons in Massachusetts or back in Philadelphia. Collectors would like these. and very much in tune with what other, 1920s American painters were doing at the time. So it's brightly colored. You can see easily those dashes of paint strokes. The brush strokes are readily visible. You can look and see how he uses the purpley hues to be shadowed colors in the composition. I love how the telephone poles kind of bend and sway, giving the whole thing kind of a rhythmic movement. And he has created a composition that leads your eye through the little village off into the distance to the ships at the docks. Not unlike the painting that the Brandywine Museum of Art owns, also a Gloucester scene. This one is even more high key in its palette and even more almost like saccharine sweetness. It looks like the colors of a cake. We've got clearly the character of Gloucester as those tightly built together small houses and shacks and sheds. And you've got, oh man, boy, do you got a lot of utility lines in Gloucester all the way to the edge of the sea. Can you get electricity or telephone calls or whatever it might be? It always is interesting to me that impressionists of an earlier generation often painted those things out because they were so modern. It was they thought as if the telephone poles were ruining their paintings, but Freelon and the next generation of American modernists and impressionists really embraced that as a sign of modernity as well. Now, not to let you think he only does these pastel themed paintings, here's another example, and I've never seen this painting in person. This is from a slide that is in the Archives of American Art, but it is called Summer Morning Gloucester, and you feel the much more earthy tones. It is summertime. Maybe it's not that bright, high noon quality of light. Maybe you see long stretching shadows across the street, so maybe it is the sun has just risen and it's still burning off whatever haze there might be. But you have the same sense of the composition that leads you through the character of the town with its small buildings and these little geometric shapes and forms. But then if you take a look at the way the leaves on the trees are painted, it's very brushy. He's using his brush stroke to imitate the leaves on the trees. So very much in line with the American Impressionist painters. Meanwhile, back in Pennsylvania, and this is where I think some of you, may feel something familiar here. He had moved, he had gotten married, as we saw in 1918, and he had moved to Telford, as many artists did who lived and worked in the or who worked in the city, I should say. They sought out homes and residences and country studios. I think, for instance, of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts teacher Daniel Garber, who very famously lived out in Bucks County as well, and made that commute on a daily basis because the train made it possible. And as I understand it, Mr. Freelon also took the train from there in Telford. If someone knows exactly where the train station was in the 1930s, for instance, they might be able to track down how close it is or is not to his home, which was called Windy Crest. And Windy Crest is located or was located on Melvin Road. So, you've text me later with directions. Melvin Road, where he had rented a very typical Pennsylvania farmhouse, and he had also has this barn and the property there, and he's renovated the barn and the property. If you look closely, the back of that white house has an extension off of it. It's kind of low slung and dark colored, and that is a studio. And then that barn that you see in the distance was also used to show artworks, because at Windy Crest, Allan Freelon held his own school. Here's a photograph of some of the students at his home studio and school. Freelon never discriminated between male and female students or Black and white students. And he
going on in my ear, so I can't hear what you're saying. I guess he said I wasn't.
Okay, thank you, Nicole. So you can also see one of the things I found in his records, a postcard that you could fill out if you wanted to be his student. I'm enclosing enrollment fee of $10. I also know from reading up that classes were held on Thursdays from 6:30 to 10:30, and then on Saturdays from 1 to 5. And it costs $3.50 a class, but if you bought 10 classes in a row, you could get them for $30. So in addition to his teaching and his work in the Philadelphia School District, which we'll come back and talk about some of his accomplishments, he was also had this studio at home where he invited students in. And because he kept great records, he kept a diary and a calendar of the most mundane things, like what was the weather every day of the week. But also, he kept notes on what he bought for the studio, little repairs that he made, supplies that he bought. So because of that, we know that he had props around for still life painting for his students. There wasn't just the landscape outside. He also had purchased printmaking supplies for his students, so he was teaching that as well. And he also made a record of paying for models, including nude models for his students. So it was, it was a full service art experience. And within his records, there are many more photographs, almost like he was documenting his studio and his house as, proof of how the school was running. He also gave lectures. He wasn't just teaching art, he was giving lectures, not just at his school, but at other places. And his lecture notes and slide sets are still surviving, so we can actually recreate some of his lectures. One of the places he gave lectures was at Haverford College. He was invited through a program of the American Friends Service Committee, which was working to improve racial relations, especially across American college campuses. And the committee offered visiting professorships, or visiting lectureships, I should say, to Black lecturers who were outstanding in their field. And it wasn't just art, it could be in any academic field. But Mr. Freelon was tapped for that, and it was lectures for both students and faculty members. So here you see him at Haverford College in 1947. What you might not recognize is he's standing around chatting with probably some young students or young faculty members, is the work of art on the wall. There is a print that he made. So this is the print itself. It's called Road Menders from 1935. It is like many of Freelon's non-boat based artworks or prints. He fixates and focuses on labor of people doing whether it's jackhammering a road or welding or pushing a cart in a market. All those sorts of things are represented. And you have to remember it's the 1930s. So this is the era of the Depression. So picturing work and people having work to do and progress being made is actually an underlying theme in a lot of his especially his prints. This interest in social realism, both printing realistically, but also addressing some social concerns and how people were making livings, how they were recovering from the Depression. There's another print I'm thinking of where it is a man and a woman, and she's wearing a fur coat, and they're standing in front of a department store window looking and dazzling, but there is a man panhandling by that window asking for help at what is the Christmas season then. So he was taking note of this throughout the city of Philadelphia. Now back just for a few minutes to his work in the Philadelphia schools. He didn't spend a lot of time teaching in classrooms since he was in an administrative role. He spent a lot of time visiting classrooms and setting up programs for students. So I've spoken to one of his former students who is still living, who benefited by Mr. Freelon's dedication to his students. The young artist was named Peter Payon. He is a very distinguished artist who we've had exhibitions of in the past at the museum, and he was on the faculty at the Pennsylvania Academy for such a long time. But he got his start because he was just a boy in school, and his art teachers recognized his talent. And Mr. Freelon came to Peter Payon's home in South Philly because his parents didn't want to let him go to an art school on the other side of the city. But he encouraged them to let their son get the benefit of everything the art education system could offer them, to let him leave the neighborhood, to go on to take special education classes in art. That's just one example. And that ties into the image you're seeing on the right from 1960. That is the year that Freelon died. And so he was still working for the city and for the art education department at that time. What he's doing right there is pinning a little gold key onto the lapel of the young man. Mr. Freelon started a program, an arts contest and competition throughout all the schools of the city of Philadelphia, with the best examples being put in a yearly exhibition and the prize winners getting a pin from Mr. Freelon. And I've seen some of these in person from former students who have saved them for all these years. So he really encouraged young students to, and again, Black and white and male and female. And I'm a historian of women artists, and it just feels so unusual for someone to encourage a young woman to pursue art in this time too. And I just, in looking at these images tonight, preparing for this, or today, in the group image on the left-hand side, there's a young boy on the right who's holding what looks like a drawing of a soldier. And I just put two and two together tonight and realized that that young man is named Nathan Margulis, and that print he is holding is now in the Brandywine's collection. I had never looked at this since we acquired that print. I had not looked at this photograph. I knew that he was affiliated with Peter Payon, but I should have guessed that Allan Freelon was his teacher as well. So look for that to be on view at the Brandywine in a few months, actually. The educational programs he offered, in addition to those prizes for the younger students, had even the older students' prize-winning works being donated back to the city of Philadelphia, to the school districts to use as decoration inside the schools. And so these very professional-looking works are coming out of the school system in Philadelphia. And you see Allan Freelon in the background of both of these, congratulating the students as they're presenting works to the city of Philadelphia. His own artwork continued to advance and progress. We've got here a catalog from the 1928 Harmon Foundation exhibition. The Harmon Foundation supported African-American arts throughout the early 20th, well, and still does, but the early 20th century, creating exhibitions that traveled the country to show off not just works of art that were by Black artists, but works of art concerning Black life, Black identity, and Black culture. So Allan Freelon participated in many of those. I just thought I'd show you an example here and remind you that this is the time in American history when the so-called Harlem Renaissance was taking place in the city of New York, but also had its reach to other metropolitan areas, including Philadelphia, where it was often called a flowering of African-American art and culture and music and literature and painting and dance and all of these things. And so Freelon was there and involved and in the midst of it. In 1933, he was invited by Hale Woodruff to teach at Atlanta University. And this is just so striking. Hale Woodruff is such a leading artist in American, especially in mural arts, but then he was developing art programs for HBCUs, and he sought out Allan Freelon's expertise to help build some of the programs at places like Atlanta University. So I just geeked out at seeing Hale Woodruff's signed letter in the Freelon papers. among the many cultural organizations that Freelon was involved with in Philadelphia was the Pyramid Club. It was a social club aimed at African American citizens, especially businessmen and upper middle class society members who could come together in this club format, but also hold things like, as since Freelon was involved, he organized art exhibitions for the club. But it's wonderful because this club in particular had a habit of recording everything in these pictorial albums. So you would get, it's like a magazine yearbook at the end of the year, and it shows the club's activities from the entire year. So I'm showing you 1941 on the left side, and on the right side is a picture from inside that yearbook showing and letting us know that that year Allan Freelon invited and was a guest speaker along with Elaine Locke at the very first art exhibition that the Pyramid Club held. Elaine Locke is such an important thinker in especially early 20th century cultural movements around African-American life, and especially the Harlem Renaissance. The phrase, and we'll see it again in a few minutes, the new Negro was something, a phrase that he coined to describe this newly, revitalized interest in history and roots and understanding African heritage. But this is an interesting photograph because Allan Freelon and Elaine Locke did not see eye to eye on the new Negro movement and the Harlem Renaissance. Not that Allan Freelon was against African Americans participating in the arts and culture, but let me read to you something that he said in response to Dr. Locke. He said, while it is true that new talents were discovered and encouraged, it is equally true that the so-called Renaissance and the emergence of what Dr. Locke has called the new Negro offered a field day for writers of both races to advance their pet theories as to what the Negro should paint or sculpt. He made much more sophisticated arguments, but I'll boil it down to this. He loved the idea of people being able to paint what they wanted. And if he wanted to go to Gloucester and paint sailboats, he didn't want to feel the cultural pressure of being told or asked to please represent something that was culturally related to Black history, right? He didn't want people to tell anyone what they should or should not be painting. And so that deep emphasis on painting or writing about deep cultural roots was something that Freelon didn't choose to do himself, but also kind of worried that it might have a negative impact on artists who would think that is all they should be painting or writing about or composing about. So, it's not exactly two sides of the same coin, but the two of them must have had a fascinating discussion that night during the inaugural art exhibition there in Philadelphia. Now, there are a couple of other things just from that notebook, from that yearbook. There's Allan Freelon introducing the director of the Philadelphia Art Museum to give a speech at the Pyramid Club. Here he is with Charles White, a very, very well-known and highly respected African-American artist who's just had a retrospective at the Art Institute of Chicago that traveled to the Whitney Museum, just there he is. He's in with all the most important people in the American art world. I wanted to just take a second to let you know that the next couple of images I'm going to be showing you might be a little bit difficult to look at because while Mr. Freelon didn't often deal with issues that had to do with race. He was an American Impressionist and he painted lovely views of landscapes. And when he did prints, he did social realism, but not always with an eye to changing people's minds about social policy or social justice. He was asked to do two things that he completed that had to do with the theme of lynching. So the first image that I'm going to show you is a cover design he did for the North Carolina magazine and some of the sketches that he created while he was working on that I found in his notes. So on the right-hand side, you see the cover image for the New Negro, called the New Negro, for the Carolina magazine. And it has some of the themes in it that you would expect, based on the New Negro movement, an emphasis on African imagery. There's a tribal kind of mask in the background behind this figure. There is far in the background 3 crosses, cavalry relating to Christian beliefs, but also in the tree to the left, you see bodies that are hanging by their necks. And you see on the left-hand side some illustrations that he was experimenting with to illustrate a story within this magazine, trying to select the moments of that are portrayed, the moments that take place during the act of a public lynching. These were in 1928. In 1934, there was a national exhibition that took place that was sponsored by the NAACP, and it was called Art Commentary on Lynching. And while Freelon didn't often make commentaries in his works of art, he was asked to participate, and he thought back, I believe, to his experiences during the war, to witnessing the young men be hanged for a crime they had possibly committed. And he created an image called Barbecue American Style. And it shows a Black figure being tortured and chained. And it was used in this exhibition to cast a spotlight on lynchings that were still going on in the United States. Freelon's work, was very gripping, and it added to many of the images in the exhibition that just sort of stopped your heart in seeing how cruel and horrible this practice is. Freelon, and I'm showing you just a black and white image of it here, and an article about the exhibition from 1934. He said of this work, "I have not attempted to portray any particular lynching, but merely to record the horror of what has come to be a major sports event." And you might notice the circle of feet, healed and well-healed feet that stand around this body that's being tortured and burned in this case. Allan Freelon, and I'm wrapping up here. The one very good work regarding his history is an exhibition that took place at the North Carolina Central University Art Museum in 2004. It was called Allan Freelon, a Pioneer American Impressionist. And it lays out his history, but it is sort of the first book of what I hope will be more books, especially when you consider the gorgeous printmaking of the city of Philadelphia. I mean, these are like love letters to the city of Philadelphia that Allan was undertaking that weren't really treated in a book about him as an impressionist. I'm going to skip right over to the legacy of Allan Freelon just a little bit here. Allan Freelon's grandson is Philip Freelon, and Philip Freelon is the architect who is in part responsible for the building you see him standing in front of there, the Smithsonian African American History and Culture Museum in Washington, D.C. So there's a picture of Phil Freelon on the right-hand side, and on the left-hand side is a children's illustrated book about Phil Freelon and what he did. Now, if you look inside that book, there's an interesting spread inside that displays, that depicts young Phil visiting his grandfather in that studio that we were just looking at. And if you look, you might see some familiar paintings in the background, like a red barn hanging on the back wall. And the text on this page, illustrated by Laura Freeman, says, "Someone in his family shows him a strength he holds inside. His pop-up, Allan Randall Freelon, is an educator and Harlem Renaissance painter. In his studio, Phil sees pastel homes by harbors, fishermen, still wet canvases, and palettes with oily colors dare him to touch." So I wanted to just think of this as one aspect of the legacy of Allan Freelon. So not only did his grandson Philip, his great granddaughter Maya, his other members of his family who are educators or who are musicians or storytellers. And I'm hoping to just continue to be a storyteller about Allan Freelon's work as I read through some of the more of the documents that are now available and get to know the family's body of work better. So I'm going to stop my sharing, but I can always bring it back if there's a particular work that you wanted to look at or ask about. But I'm happy to answer questions or hear you tell me about Telford in the 1930s and where that train station was.
I want to thank you so much. It was very informative. We don't currently have any questions in the chat, but go ahead if you want to. You can put questions in the chat and I will read them out, or you can unmute yourself and ask some questions. I'm wondering if it is the train station by where we have the Telford night markets, but I'm not sure. That's the first one I think about. But I was not around in the 1930s.
No, and I've been looking around at other small communities where an artist was working. So in Chadds Ford with N.C. Wyeth, and in Malvern and Paoli with Wharton Esherick, and how important that I don't know if when it became SEPTA, but how important that train line that took these artists into Philadelphia to either go to art school, visit studios, see clients, or get commissions from publishers. So that train line was ever very important. Oh, I think there are questions. Let me see if I can see them. Nicole, can you see them?
Yep, I see them now.
Okay.
So the first one is, do you know where Mr. Freelon is buried?
Oh, that is a good question. I think I'll turn that back around on you to say, if you were buried in the 1930s in Telford, I don't know any church that he belonged to. So that's always a likely candidate. But if any of you local folks know, I mean, it's always possible he was buried in Philadelphia, but I've talked to a former neighbor who was a young boy at the day of Mr. Freelon's death. And he told me the story of hearing his wife screaming from across down the road, hearing the sound because she had discovered her husband had died, and was very inconsolable. But, I didn't think to ask where if it was a church or a town cemetery or where it might be. Let me know if you find out.
All right, thank you. The next question, are there any records of Allan Freelon's experience of race relations in Telford?
Not that I've found so far, but there's a lot of material to read through. And I think it's possible that even just in something like his daily diaries, his calendar that says what he did, where he went in a certain day, there are articles that he's written and published. So in the debate with Elaine Locke, he made a response to talk about why it's important not to pressure artists to paint in a certain way or a certain topic. But he didn't talk about that. In that respect, that wouldn't have been a discussion of his local experiences. I think it's far more likely as I or other people go through those simple daily records and news clippings he might have kept, that sort of thing, that's where we might find these. And I'm not going to lie, I go to the pictures first, but I am working my way through the rest of the documents as well, especially for my interest, his art lectures, to understand what he was teaching. So, I mean, there's another point of view to look at what is happening locally in Telford when he lives there. Was there an incident? Was there a political candidate? Was there something that he may have felt the need to comment on, or, support a political candidate or something like that? Yeah.
Okay, that is very interesting. Just to let you know, we do have
Somebody found it.
Yeah, the microfiche for the local paper way back, including in the 1930s and the time when he would have lived here. So if anyone's interested, you can come check our records. Yeah, someone said they found it's Shelton Hills Cemetery, which is actually down the street from where I live in Philadelphia.
Wow.
Like when I do my morning walks, I actually walk past that cemetery. So maybe I'll try to see if I can take a detour
Yeah.
inside. But it,
Remember, you're looking for 1960. He's technically Allan Randall Freelon Sr. He had a son with the same name. Um, he had two wives, but I don't know so he wasn't be buried with the one we mentioned earlier. If he is buried there, I mean, if his second wife is buried there, but I think she outlived him by quite a while. Yeah.
all right. Well, I'll
Take a
see.
look.
Yeah, I'll see. I might take a little road trip, field trip myself.
Yeah.
Very quickly. It's so interesting how closely things are connected.
Yeah.
We're having some comments in here, just about how wonderful it is. This presentation is, and thank you for introducing us to someone. Um, and they hope to see more works. So I
Yeah.
know we kind of talked while we were talking about it before. Your hope is to have a multi-generational exhibit at
Mm-hmm.
okay.
Yeah,
Um,
I'd love to be able to do more than just what the Brandywine owns in terms of works of art, to be able to borrow works from other museums and from the family themselves, who still hold quite a few of the original paintings, and to be able to combine his painting, his prints, and his photography in a way that also explains or talks about, especially the illustration you saw there, what an inspiration he was, not just to this, the students he taught in Philadelphia, but to the members of his own family who then looked up to him and saw a role model of someone in the creative field that they could follow in the footsteps of.
Thank you so much. Are there any additional questions before we let everyone go? I know we used to own the picture book that was about his Neil Freelon. Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
about Phil Freelon. Yeah,
Phil Yawn.
yep,
And unfortunately, people weren't checking it out, and I
yeah.
wish we could keep everything, but unfortunately, we don't have that anymore. If anyone is interested in reading that, we can do something called interlibrary loan, where we can borrow it from another library for you. Um, but sometimes it's a shame that some people don't read the things that are so closely connected to our community.
Yeah, and
Um,
that copy of the catalog from the University of Carolina, Central North Carolina, that's so rare as well. I had to go to Temple University to read their copy of it. So if you can find it online, it's hundreds of dollars on top of it all.
Well, thank you so much. I'm going to end the recording. And again, I am going to be sending this out. So if you want to rewatch this or share it with other people, it will be available for a brief period of time. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.